Hi Internet, welcome to the Gredtroin YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I did 16 videos ranking the Final Fantasy games in a number of different categories. It was a ton of work, and I ended up producing more than 10 hours worth of content. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the project, despite some gripes with audio quality and repetitive prose. That's what I get for making a ridiculously massive project with a completely arbitrary deadline that would become immediately irrelevant after its release. But I had a lot to say about the series, had a lot to get out of my system, and there are still some commentary threads in the videos I wish I had clarified more. Like the fact that while 15 might feel like an incomplete story, it definitely is a complete story. It's just lacking proper transition scenes, and instead opted to use inelegant text dumps. Speaking of awkward transitions, let me do one myself. While I love Final Fantasy, I mentioned a few times in that series of videos how much I love Chrono Trigger, and how it's one of my favorite games of all time. I've gotten a number of comments asking me to talk about the game in greater detail, so I decided that I would do a video ranking all of the games in the Chrono franchise. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that's going to be a short list. You've only got 2 games in the series, Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross. Chrono Trigger number 1, Chrono Cross number 2. Like, comment, and subscribe. Boom, done, video over. And then you might be thinking, oh, he's going to be clever and add Radical Dreamers. Okay, he's ranking 3 games. Still going to be a short video. But what if I told you there were 11 Chrono games? Not 2, not 3, 11. There are the 3 main games in the series, Chrono Trigger, Radical Dreamers, and Chrono Cross, obviously. But did you know that there are also 4 fully completed fan games with original stories in the forms of Prophet's Guile, Chrono Source, Chrono Alter, and the infamous Crimson Echoes, aka Flames of Eternity? In addition to those fan games, there's another Eden, a time travel game made by Masato Kato that full-on features characters from the Chrono series and music from Yasunori Mitsuda. Beyond that, there are also a couple of Square games that began their development as Chrono sequels before being turned into a different IP, but the Chrono DNA is still very much in those games, like Xenogears and Final Fantasy Dimensions 2. So, for me, I'm counting all of the above as games in the Chrono series and ranking them. Now, this list is just my personal opinion, and I'm sure plenty of you will disagree with the order of the ranking and what I even count as a Chrono game. My criteria is that fan games count, as long as they are fully complete and tell a completely original story, so mods of the original game with minor changes or some new areas don't count for me as a new game in the series. I know fan-made films and games have a lot of controversy, and generally aren't well regarded, and I get that, because most fan-made films and games are pretty terrible. There's often a sense of ego, a sense of, I know better than the creators, and it's usually stuff made by immature dudes without the slightest sense of storycraft. The Chrono series is a bit different though, because instead of being born out of a desire to quote-unquote do it right, where the devs got things wrong, instead it's just a desire to see the franchise continue to live after being left on life support from Square Enix with next to no new content. A lot of fan projects are made out of spite, but basically every Chrono fan project seems to come from a place of love, and that love generally leads to a greater level of care and quality. So I'm counting the fan games. I'm also counting games that began their development as Chrono sequels, and then changed midway through development, because they are fascinating to see what could have been, parallel universe Chrono games, and it's interesting to see what elements of the series remained in the finished products. Another Eden, while never officially a Chrono sequel, and never intended to be one, was made by the guy who helmed all 3 official Chrono games, has time travel, Luca, a talking frog knight, music by Mitsuda, and is basically a Chrono game, but Kato just doesn't own the IP. So for me it counts, and I'll justify it even more when we get to it in the ranking. What about games like Sea of Stars, Cosmic Star Heroine, and I Am Setsuna, which take either mechanical and or visual inspiration from Chrono Trigger? For me, those don't count on this list, because otherwise any RPG with turn-based battles and time travel could potentially count, and the line had to be drawn somewhere. At no point were any of those games designed to be a sequel to Chrono Trigger. Another Eden, while it was never designed to be a Chrono sequel, has enough similarities between the original game, including development staff, that makes me consider it part of the franchise, whereas Sea of Stars, Cosmic Star Heroine, and I Am Setsuna don't feature staff crossover or enough narrative and thematic similarities for me to consider them to count on this list. If I counted them, then does that mean that Radiant Historia, Final Fantasy XIII-2, and Live Alive count because they have time travel? What about RPG Maker games that use Chrono Trigger sprites? No, to be on this list, it needs to be either an official part of the franchise, a game originally developed as a Chrono sequel, a fully completed fan game with an original story, or, in the case of another Eden, an intentional spiritual successor in the same way Xenosaga is a spiritual successor to Xenogears. I'm sure there are many who will disagree with what is even on this list, but hey, that's what the comment section is for, right? For me, this list is as much a chance to showcase that these great games exist, and to hopefully encourage die-hard Chrono fans to check them out, as I'm sure there are folks out there like me who love Chrono Trigger and desperately want to play another game in the franchise. And if I can help them discover a cool, quote-unquote new Chrono game, then I'm glad to shine that spotlight. Personally, I like every game on this list, and it's hard to rank these 11 games, but I'll do my best. Before we begin, I want to give a couple quick, honorable mentions to incomplete Chrono games that looked like they could have been something special, but sadly never came to be. Chrono Resurrection was meant to be a short fan game that remade certain highlights from the original game in full 3D that looked truly stunning for the era, but sadly got a cease and desist from Square. Chrono Shift was an RPG Maker project that featured an entirely original cast set in a new adventure in the Chrono universe that looked like it understood the spirit of the original game, but again, never was completed. And while never intended to be a game, the fan concept trailer for a fictionalized Chrono Break looked like a lot of fun, featuring what appeared to be a descendant of Magus as the main character, fighting alongside an elderly Luca against a more humanoid member of the Lavos race. If these 3 games existed, I'd love to play them, and while that's a shame they don't exist, luckily there's 11 other games I was able to play, beat, and share my thoughts on with you lovely folks. Alright, enough preamble. Let's get into this ranking of the 11 Chrono games. Number 11, Chrono Source. So, I will admit to not knowing that this game even existed until I was already starting work on this video essay. I decided to check to see if there were any completed Chrono fan games I might have missed out on, and sure enough, I found one I had never heard of. Released on Halloween 2015, Chrono Source is a fan prequel to Chrono Trigger that stars Scala as she travels across time to rescue her brother Jonas, who disappeared across space-time, and along the way she needs to stop an evil villain from the past who seeks ultimate power. It's a full 10 to 20 hour RPG with turn-based combat, multiple world maps, and even side quests. Like Chrono Trigger, you travel between different time periods, and the time periods are often close to the time eras in the original Chrono Trigger, but not quite the same. Instead of 12,000 BC, you go to 12,005 BC. The general idea here is that Chrono Source shows what the timeline was like before Chrono and his friends altered history, and by that same token, what the timeline was like before the Ocean Palace incident, and thus before Janus traveled to the Middle Ages. So seeing things like the Middle Ages without Magus and what that would be like is certainly interesting. A lot of the writing feels like a Disney Star Wars prequel, where it will have a big fan-servicey moment to get you to point at the screen and say something like, "So that's how the Massa Moon was first made," but it's still enjoyable. The game's cast is a hybrid between characters from the original game and new characters created specifically for Chrono Source. Scala acts as the game's protagonist, and like Chrono, is not a replaceable party member and needs to be on your team at all times. Other companions include Chrono's uncle, a girl from the year 1999 AD, a human version of Glenn from 600 AD, and the most fun original character from this game, a Reptite king named Drago, not to be confused with the villain from Rocky IV. The game even boasts a hidden optional character, Flea, who is by far the most useful party member combat-wise, and never left my party after recruitment. I do like that this game introduces some original party members to play as, and I wish more Chrono fan games would put an emphasis on new characters. Drago is a great character, and while the other newly created party members are a bit lackluster, I'm glad the attempt was at least made to mix fresh ideas with established ones. It's interesting to see Scala traveling through time. It makes for some interesting implications regarding Chrono Trigger and her knowledge of the party's actions during the course of the original game. While I did enjoy my time with Chrono Source, out of all the games on this list, it's the most flawed. Mechanically, it's very much an RPG Maker game with turn-based combat, and the difficulty balancing isn't the best. Like Chrono Trigger, there are no random battles, and you can see enemies on screen before engaging in battle, but a big difference between Chrono Trigger and Chrono Source is the map design. And when I say big, I mean big. Chrono Source has massive maps, which tend to raise the difficulty of exploration. It does give the game a unique gameplay identity in comparison to its predecessor, and does feel like a unique take on a Chrono sequel for that reason. But the inconsistency of sprite sizes, along with the fact that the game does not allow for a full screen option, hurts the experience. I had to manually zoom in on my PC to make the game more playable, but for all my complaints about graphics, the sprites do look nice. and the game was able to keep in small details like the party members following you around on the map and clouds blowing in the wind. There was clearly care put into the graphics, despite their flaws. To play the game, I did need to utilize Joy-to-Key for control optimization. Joy-to-Key, for those who don't know, is a program that maps your game controller to keystrokes on your computer. While the game did have controller setup, you can't modify it, and for some reason the run button wasn't mapped to the in-game controller setup. Oh, and when installing the game, Windows thought it was a virus, so I had to download the game multiple times and set it up as an exception before Windows immediately removed the program. So yeah, it's a bit of a hassle optimizing this experience. Chrono Source very much feels like a fan game in a lot of ways. The awkward character portraits are probably the most obvious example, as they look like something from the early days of DeviantArt. The cutscene direction is, for the most part, a bit too simplistic. There are a lot of, for lack of a better word, interesting music choices that I'm not sure I would have made. Certain pieces of music from the original game are used in awkward places, and there are some new compositions that are equally awkward. However, when the music hits, man does it hit. And there's a remixed version of a song from Chrono Trigger that almost made me cry because it was so beautiful. A lot of the game feels very fanfiction-y in its writing, like Ozzy also being a time traveler. Also, like many a fanfiction, the game is littered with typos and odd Western influences that don't mess with the original game. The most egregious example of this is when the game awkwardly shoves in some libertarian propaganda into the dialogue of certain NPCs. I find it hilarious that the author's idea of a totalitarian future is one where there is regulation on weapons, taxes, and unions exist. I've uploaded some screenshots of the absurdly silly dialogue for you to view, but I neglected to get a screen cap of a character complaining about how their town has a cleaning tax for cleaning up the town, aka infrastructure, aka basic governance. Literally, it's a libertarian complaint about taxes for roads. It's the meme. It's literally the meme. As much as I hate libertarian ideology and consider it one of the greatest cancers on societal thought, I thought its inclusion in this game was pretty hilarious and actually added to the charm of the game for me, especially considering that the game's very existence is violation of intellectual property. Maybe the author is a full-on ANCAP and thinks that property defense should all be down to militias, but I'm expecting it's more just short-sighted hypocrisy and not thinking the commentary through. Chrono Source very much feels like a fan game and it has a lot of issues, but it feels fun, and it is a complete game. There are enough interesting narrative choices that make the game worthwhile. Lavos is hinted at enough in the game where it leads into Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross well enough. The narrative of Chrono Source feels appropriately small in scale to the original game, but it feels like a grand adventure in its own right. Overall, even with some issues in regards to the writing, the story feels close enough to canon, and I did enjoy my time with the game despite its flaws. I liked every game on this list for different reasons, and while playing the game I did at times feel like I was playing Chrono Trigger, and that's an extremely special experience. Number 10. Chrono Trigger, Prophet's Guile. Chrono Trigger, Prophet's Guile is the first fully completed Chrono Trigger fan game featuring an original narrative to be released. Unlike Chrono Source, which was made in RPG Maker XP, Chrono Trigger, Prophet's Guile is a ROM hack of the original Chrono Trigger and plays identical to the Super Nintendo original. Prophet's Guile is a short 1 to 4 hour RPG where you play as Magus after his battle with Chrono and companions. Flung back into the year 12,000 BC, the player controls Magus as he takes on the identity of the Prophet and rises to power in Zeal society in order to exact his revenge upon Lavos. Prophet's Guile is short and feels almost like what a DLC chapter for Chrono Trigger would have been if such a thing existed back in the 90s. Magus is the only controllable character in this game, and given that he's one of my favorite characters in the original game, I don't mind that you're going on a solo Magus adventure, but it does add some tedium in regards to balancing healing with fighting the enemies you encounter. The game is overall balanced well, but it's definitely a hair harder than the original game due to the nature of only having a single party member to control. You're not getting new locations or a ton of lore here, but you are getting more Chrono Trigger. a little more story, and because it's in the same engine as Chrono Trigger, it ends up feeling very canon, aside from a couple of lines of dialogue that feels a little fanfiction-y. There's not as much to say about this game, because it's not offering much in terms of new ideas, but it's also far more polished, competent, and balanced than Chrono Source. It's not littered with typos, and because it's in the same engine as the original game, it just feels like you're playing more Chrono Trigger. While I might have more to say about Chrono Source than Prophet's Guile, the latter is by far the better game in terms of execution, and feels far closer to an official release from Square Enix than it does to a fan game. The only real weaknesses in Prophet's Guile are how short it is and how little it adds to the overall lore of the series. Prophet's Guile is exactly what you expect from a short game playing as Magus in 12,000 BC, but still a lot of fun. In the end, Prophet's Guile played it very safe in terms of what it set out to do, and isn't the most ambitious narrative in the series, but it's monumental in regards to Chrono fan games because it's the first one that was actually completed, and showed what was possible from the Chrono community. It showed that fans could create a full, complete game that fits in with the established canon of the Chrono games, and it showed that fans could create a fan game using the original game as the source engine. It's really incredible what the devs were able to do with this game, and it was ultimately a stepping stone to one of the greatest fan games ever created. But we'll get to that later on in the ranking. Chrono Trigger Prophet's Guile is a fun game that succeeds in exactly what it set out to do. Create a short Chrono Trigger fan game that fills in an unseen part of the story using the same engine as the original game. The time investment to play Prophet's Guile is so short that I can't see why any fan of Chrono Trigger wouldn't want to check this out. Knock it out in an evening and enjoy some more Chrono Trigger goodness. Number 9. Radical Dreamers. Radical Dreamers is the first official sequel to Chrono Trigger. Unlike the other games on this list, which are mostly turn-based JRPGs, and a few with an ATB system, Radical Dreamers is a text-based visual novel that plays closer to a choose-your-own-adventure book than Chrono Trigger. It was originally released only on the Japanese Satellaview add-on for the Super Nintendo, and for many years, the only way to play the game in English was through a fan translation on emulator. But now an official localized version of the game comes bundled with Chrono Cross if you buy a copy of Chrono Cross, the Radical Dreamers edition. Radical Dreamers tells the story of a group of thieves named Surge, Kid, and McGill as they adventure inside the mysterious Viper Manor to steal the mansion's greatest treasure, a magical artifact known as the Frozen Flame. However, they must contend with all kinds of monsters, traps, puzzles, and the villainous lord of the manor Lynx if they hope to claim the flame for themselves. I absolutely loved choose-your-own-adventure novels when I was a kid, so I don't mind the visual novel format for a narrative. But I wonder if a visual novel is the best medium for telling this particular story in the way the devs chose to tell it. I've often said that I wish more video games were just books, because of the greater longevity of the latter medium, but given how much of Radical Dreamers' narrative is based around exploration of a cool, spooky mansion, it feels awkward that all of the exploration is text-based, as opposed to more traditional player movement. Add in the fact that the game literally has random battles, and it feels like an even more peculiar choice for the way the devs chose to tell this game's story. The gameplay in Radical Dreamers is mostly trekking back and forth through the manor, solving puzzles, making dialogue choices with NPCs, and, as previously mentioned, occasionally doing a random battle or two. The random battles are an odd choice in this game, given the fact that you, the player, have a set amount of HP, but there's no way to see this at any point in the game. There's also a lot of backtracking that needs to be done in Radical Dreamers, and given that you don't have a map of the manor, or a lot of visual cues to remember where you are, it can be a bit of a hassle and a little confusing getting your bearings straight. However, for me, story is king, and the story in Radical Dreamers is actually pretty darn good. Because the game is a visual novel, you get a lot more characterization for our leading man, Surge, than you would get in most RPGs. And in many ways, playing Radical Dreamers feels more like cozying up with a really solid YA novel than playing an RPG. There's a good degree of hormonal, will they won't they teen romance with Surge and Kid, and there's even a hidden affection system that can alter how certain scenes play out based on how you interact with her over the course of the adventure. Radical Dreamers is a relatively short game that can be beaten in around 2 to 3 hours on your first playthrough, but like Chrono Trigger, the game has multiple endings, and if you want to get all of them, it'll probably be closer to around 7 hours of playtime. Like Chrono Trigger, Radical Dreamers offers a New Game Plus feature, and certain endings are only possible to obtain after you've entered the New Game Plus mode. There are serious endings, endings that tie into Chrono Trigger lore far more than other endings, and there are also incredibly hilarious joke endings that are truly a sight to behold. As I mentioned, the game feels more like a novel than a video game, especially given the fact that you never really see close-ups of our main heroes throughout the course of the game. Radical Dreamers leaves a lot to the imagination, and one wonders if it would have been better served not as a video game at all, and instead was just an actual book, as the gameplay systems and graphical presentation don't lend to the medium's strengths. However, the music in Radical Dreamers is excellent, and helps add a lot of atmosphere to the experience, helping set the emotional mood for the text far greater than any of the game's visuals. A lot of these compositions would be later used in Chrono Cross, but some are actually better in this game than in the latter. A prime example would be Guile, which can be a bit grating in Chrono Cross, but sounds fantastic with the SNES sound font. A lot of the ideas in Radical Dreamers were later reworked into Chrono Cross, and in many ways, this game feels more like a rough draft for Chrono Cross than a video game in its own right. However, despite this, Radical Dreamers has its own distinct identity, and is markedly different from the game that follows in its footsteps. While Lynx and Kid occupy similar narrative roles in both games, Surge became a silent protagonist, Guile lost his connections to Magus, and Viper Manor became distinctively less creepy. While Chrono Cross is ultimately a better game, some cool elements from Radical Dreamers were lost in the transition, and I do think those elements are worth experiencing. And it's not made completely irrelevant by Chrono Cross either, as it's heavily implied that the universe of Radical Dreamers is an alternate timeline inside the Chronoverse. I think Radical Dreamers would benefit greatly by a fan remake in the style of Chrono Trigger, with traditional RPG exploration and combat, as the biggest flaws of the game are the lack of spatial awareness and the hidden nature of stats in regards to the game's combat mechanics. However, even with the game's flaws, I really loved my experience with it. I'm a book lover, so I don't mind that Radical Dreamers is more of a book than a video game. I got all the different endings and had an absolute blast with it. If you're a bibliophile like myself and want some more Chrono lore, you should absolutely play Radical Dreamers. It's an official canon release and is definitely worth checking out. It's a fun time. Number 8. Chrono Alter. Chrono Alter is a fan-made direct sequel to Chrono Trigger. Picking up shortly after the events of the first game, Chrono and Maro are confronted by a mysteriously revived Lavos, and find themselves flung into an entirely new world. Made in RPG Maker 2003, Chrono Alter is in many ways what you would expect from a fan video game, with it reusing assets from the original game, but setting the adventure in a new world so there isn't the pressure of recreating the iconic maps of the original. And I will admit that there's a pretty big disconnect in regards to the world you explore within the game, given the lack of shared locations between Chrono Trigger and Chrono Alter. While the premise may sound a bit weak on paper, Chrono Alter succeeds so well because of how well the execution is. It's an RPG Maker game, but it's a really well-made RPG Maker game. The graphical style and overall artistic direction is generally pleasing, with plenty of bright colors that feels like a continuation of the overall Chrono Trigger approach, but with a distinct twist, partially due to the limitations of the engine, and partially due to the creativity of the settings themselves. The music choices, all remixes from Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, Castlevania 4, Final Fantasy 4, and Final Fantasy 5, fit the game incredibly well, and it's fun hearing SNES-style versions of Chrono Cross tunes. The turn-based battles are well balanced, and like the original Chrono Trigger, there are no random battles, but instead all enemies can be seen on the map before you engage with them. It's not grindy, and the difficulty curve is almost identical to Chrono Trigger, which is a good thing in my book. The playable characters are all basically exactly the same as the original game, with the only major difference being the elimination of dual text and triple text, due to the limitations of the RPG Maker 2003 engine, and battles being turn-based instead of using an active time system. But again, the battles are fun and well-balanced, more so than the vast majority of RPG Maker games I played, and it's even more well-balanced than Prophet's Guile, and that game uses the actual Chrono Trigger engine. Unlike Chrono Source, another Chrono RPG Maker game, Chrono Alter has a full-screen option and perfect controller optimization right from the start. There aren't issues with map scaling like in Chrono Source, and overall the dungeon design is quite excellent. The animations in Chrono Alter are all as crisp and smooth as the original Chrono Trigger, and it's beautiful to look at. While there are some giveaways of this being an RPG Maker game in certain aspects, like the font, overall the game hides its RPG Maker constraints quite well and plays closer to Chrono Trigger than you might expect, given the limitations of the engine. The biggest surprise for me in regards to this game is actually the writing. Despite the flimsy premise of going on adventures in an entirely new world, it's well executed with great narrative pacing and plenty of strong character beats throughout the game. It's not littered with typos, and it's actually a very competently done story that does a good job of keeping the player engaged throughout the narrative, full of fun twists and turns that carries on the spirit of the original game quite well. There are strong moments of pathos in the narrative, alongside moments of pure joy and excitement. Does it feel like canon to the series? No. But is it competent and incredibly fun? Absolutely. If all of that weren't enough, the game has multiple endings, side quests, hidden bosses, and even a new Game Plus feature. It's a little shorter than the original Chrono Trigger, but not by much. It's a full-length 15 to 20 hour JRPG, and it's a well-done one at that. The only part of Chrono Alter that makes it feel like a fan game is the setting, but otherwise, Chrono Alter feels like a classic Super Nintendo RPG despite being an RPG Maker fan project. It's a hidden gem of RPG Maker games and fan games in general, and if you can get past the decision to uproot the world the adventure takes place in, you'll find a game that is faithful to Chrono Trigger in terms of fun spirit, pathos, and the characterization of heroes you know and love. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that Chrono Alter nails the characterization of the Chrono Trigger cast better than the compilation of Final Fantasy VII nailed the characterization of the Final Fantasy VII cast. Chrono Alter is a fan game, but it's a well-written, well-executed fan game with good exploration, good combat, and a good story. While I may let the pros of Radical Dreamers more, overall, I think Chrono Alter is actually a better game, and that's incredibly impressive. All in all, Chrono Alter is a fun fan game that successfully captures the spirit of the original Chrono Trigger, even with the limitations of the RPG Maker 2003 engine, and despite the unfamiliar setting, it still feels like Chrono Trigger, and yet it also has its own identity. There's no other game quite like Chrono Alter, and I'm incredibly grateful this game exists, because it's another excellent Chrono game. Give this one a shot. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Number 7. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 is the first game on this list that began its development history as a sequel to Chrono Trigger before being morphed into a different IP. Chrono Trigger was famous for bringing together a dream team of developers from both Square and Enix to work on the game, and most view Masato Kato as the main visionary for Chrono Trigger, given that he wrote the scenario and would go on to helm Radical Dreamers, Chrono Cross, and Another Eden. While Kato ended up leaving Square Enix, Chrono Trigger's director and scenario co-writer Takashi Tokita remains at the company to this day. Tokita was assigned the task of helming the infamous unreleased sequel to Chrono Cross, Chrono Break. Square had decided that the game would be a free mobile gacha game set in the Chrono universe rather than a console release. However, at a certain point in the development cycle, it was decided that the game would offer more profitability if it was a Final Fantasy title. And given the recent success of another Tokita-helmed mobile title, Final Fantasy Dimensions, Chrono Break pivoted into being a sequel to that title instead, and thus became Final Fantasy Dimensions 2. While Dimensions 2 may have begun its life as a free-to-play gacha mobile game, after the game's live service ended, it was released as a paid, standalone game with no gacha elements, exclusively to mobile phones. And PC if you know how to use BlueStacks. Despite being a quote-unquote sequel to Final Fantasy Dimensions, the game actually shares a lot more in common with Chrono Trigger than it does with Dimensions 1. In fact, aside from a brief cameo from one of the Dimensions 1 characters, and some references in the game's summons, there's basically nothing tying Dimensions 1 to Dimensions 2. So, what elements of Chrono Break remain inside Final Fantasy Dimensions 2? Well, the main plot revolves around a group of time travelers trying to prevent a kaiju monster from bringing about the apocalypse. As far as timelines the player can visit, there is the present, the Middle Ages, the Apocalypse, the post-apocalyptic future, and the distant past where a forgotten society of magically advanced individuals used to live in a utopia until their experimentations with a power beyond their control brought down their civilization. Oh, and there's also an end of time where a solitary figure hangs out isolated on a brick-laden patch of ground and offers guidance to the player in regular intervals. That's not all the parallels to the Chrono games. No, we're just getting started. In the Age of Magic, we have a pair of siblings who are considered prodigies of their magical kingdom, and both siblings get flung through time during the cataclysmic event that causes the downfall of said magical kingdom. The sister ends up being sealed and trapped away by a cosmic force against her wishes. Sound familiar? There's also a character with long hair, pointy ears, and pale skin from the magical era of the past who gets flung into the Middle Ages and declares war on the citizens of the era. He has a super spooky castle and is known as the Death Lord. Not the Fiend Lord, but the Death Lord. Oh, and he, spoilers, eventually joins your party. Those are just a few examples of the obvious parallels between the Chrono games and Dimensions 2. It's clear that a good chunk of the lore and characters in this game started off as Chrono characters and locations, and simply had the proper nouns switched as they turned it into an original adventure. There are too many Chrono parallels to list here, but it's not just Chrono Trigger that gets referenced, as there are clear stand-ins for Chronopolis, El Nido, and some really interesting plot elements that raise a lot of implications in regards to the Guile Magus thing fans have theorized about for years, and would have taken that plot point in a really interesting direction if they decided this was going to be a Chrono sequel. There are a lot of parallels to Chrono Trigger, but in many ways, they feel like references and nods to that game, in the same way that other Final Fantasy games have callbacks to earlier titles. And because this is ultimately a Final Fantasy game, it has plenty of references to other Final Fantasy games, with named characters like Minwu, Vivi, Une, Doga, King Giat, Gordon, Biggs, Wedge, Cid, Hallam, Porum, the classic summons, and more. There's also a character named Luca, but she seems to be more of a reference to Luca from Final Fantasy IV, another game helmed by Tokita. And, as mentioned previously, Alba from Final Fantasy Dimensions 1 is here as well, so you get plenty of references to both the Chrono games and the Final Fantasy games. Even with all the references to other games, and the fact that Dimensions 2 originated as a Chrono sequel, it does actually manage to carve out a unique identity for itself in terms of narrative and tone, and the cast is surprisingly strong. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that this is one of the best JRPG casts in any game I've ever played, and a lot of it is due to the fact that the game takes a lot of time to do character beats to help establish the personalities and motivations of each character in a compelling way. You get to spend a lot of time with these characters, seeing their interactions and dynamics, and by the end of the game, you'll grow to love them. I've gone this far discussing Dimensions 2 without getting into gameplay, proving how much of a story-first player I am, but I feel I should actually discuss it. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 is a turn-based JRPG with a battle system basically identical to Final Fantasy X's, showing turn order on the side, and with a level progression system basically identical to Final Fantasy IX's, where you equip an item to your character to have them learn new abilities, except the abilities aren't as passive as IX's. These equipable items, called signets, also come paired with a summon. In the original live service version of the game, these signets came from random loot box pulls. But now that's just a single game you paid $12 for, all of the signets are contained within the game and obtained through main story progression and side quests. Like Final Fantasy Tactics, there's no traditional overworld exploration, and instead you move to set locations on the world maps of the different time periods. But you can talk to NPCs in the towns you visit, and the dialogue does change after events in the game, which is a nice touch. Similar to the Star Ocean games' private actions, you can unlock episodes for different party members that show many scenarios that help flesh out the characters further, and they add a lot to the experience. On top of all that, there's an optional dungeon in the form of Babel Tower, which plays a remix of the Tower of Babel theme from Final Fantasy IV, as you fight through floor upon floor of tough encounters until you eventually reach a super boss at the top. Overall, Dimensions 2 is a pretty great game, and its only real weakness is the lack of exploration and a little bit of tedium in the battles, but I really loved my time with it. A lot of folks refuse to touch any mobile games out of a sense of elitism, but I'm glad I've given the mobile titles in the FF series a shot, because I found some real gems. With BlueStacks, you can play mobile games on your PC to enjoy a larger screen and greater performance, so to me, Dimensions 2 feels like just another great RPG I got to play. I like that with BlueStacks and other forms of emulation, the PC has become a great equalizer of games, and I'm able to play something like this alongside the original Chrono Trigger. And I like that I was able to legally purchase Dimensions 2 to play on BlueStacks, so there's no piracy involved. I like supporting the official release when I can to show support for the devs, and it's clear that this game was made with a lot of care and passion, and I'm incredibly grateful for the experience. If you enjoyed Final Fantasy Tactics despite the lack of exploration, I would definitely say to give the game a try. And if you really hate mobile gaming, again, BlueStacks is an option. It's got great gameplay, a great story, great characters, oh, and I almost forgot to mention, great music, done by arguably the most underrated Final Fantasy composer, Naoshi Mizuta, who has done work on Final Fantasy XI, 14, 13-2, Final Fantasy XV's Episode Prompto, and Final Fantasy Dimensions 1. Dude is completely an unsung hero of the series, and the music here has some nice subtle allusions to Chrono Trigger, while also having, again, its own unique identity. Dimensions 2 is an interesting experience as a Chrono fan, because you can see the skeleton of where Takeda would have taken the next game in the series, and when you compare it to Kato's approach to a Chrono spiritual successor, you can see how their different personalities and approaches blended together to make the Chrono Trigger we know and love, and you can really appreciate what they both brought to the table. All in all, a fascinating experience as a Chrono fan, but a great game in its own right. I know I've been talking about Dimensions 2 for a while, and this tangent is somewhat unrelated, so feel free to skip to the next section of the video if you're ready to move on. I just wanted to share a quick observation I had about Takashi Tokita as I was in the process of playing Dimensions 2. At this point, I played plenty of Takeda games, like Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy Dimensions 1, and Final Fantasy Dimensions 2. There has been a lot of criticism directed at Final Fantasy Dimensions 1 and Final Fantasy IV The After Years for originally being phone games with an episodic structure that involved constant party swapping between different parties until a big grand finale that united the parties at the end of the game. A lot of critics placed the blame solely at the feet of Square Enix for being greedy and trying to squeeze money out of players with an episodic release structure. But I think it has less to do with greedy business practices and more to do with the fact that those games were helmed by Tokita, whose big video game passion project was Live a Live, another game with an episodic structure that involves swapping parties until a big grand finale at the end. I think that Takeda just happens to think that particular structure is a really cool way to make a game, and I actually kinda dig it. It's unrelated to the rest of the video, but I thought it was an interesting enough tangent to mention here. Number 6. Another Eden, the Cat Beyond Time and Space. Another Eden, the Cat Beyond Time and Space, is not technically a Chrono game, nor was it ever intended to be a Chrono game at any stage in its development. Instead, this game is very much meant to be a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, in the same way that Xenosaga games were meant to be spiritual successors to Xenogears. It's not a Square Enix game, but instead was developed by the indie studio Right Flyer Studios. So, what exactly is it? Another Eden is a free-to-play turn-based RPG available on PC and mobile. Despite having gacha mechanics in regards to party recruitment, the game plays like a traditional, balanced turn-based RPG with classic overworld exploration, plenty of side quests, a rich, engaging story, and fantastic music. It's one of the best reviewed gacha games of all time, in particular because of how unintrusive the gacha elements are. You can play and beat Another Eden as if it's a normal JRPG, without encountering any of the gacha elements. There's no stamina system to worry about, and no brick walls of difficulty forcing you to buy a particular character or item with real-world currency. And because of how well designed the game is, even those generally critical of gacha games have heaped Another Eden with praise because of the lack of predatory monetization in the game. There's plenty of side content, like collecting cats to help you on your journey, full-on games within the game, and the best part is that none of the content is behind a paywall, and unlike other gacha games, content never leaves Another Eden. Once it's added, the content remains. It's a gacha game with all of the positives and none of the negatives. As such, the game has developed a highly passionate fan community who adore the game and eagerly await updates to the story, even among people who adamantly hate gacha titles. If you're looking for a solid 40-hour RPG experience, the base game tells a full narrative from beginning to end with a final boss, end credits, and a satisfying ending. If you choose, you can close the book on Another Eden the same way you would any other game, but if you want to continue the adventure, you can keep playing, the same way you would if you kept playing Final Fantasy XIV after A Realm Reborn. Another Eden can be either a tight, classic RPG, or as expansive as an MMO in terms of content. The choice is ultimately up to you, but for the low price of free, it's definitely worth taking the time to check out. That's all fine and good, but why is this game on the list? Well, the lead developer of Another Eden, Masato Kato, was the lead developer for all officially released Chrono games, Chrono Trigger, Radical Dreamers, and Chrono Cross. He was the lead scenario writer for all the games in the Chrono series, and he directed both Radical Dreamers and Chrono Cross. Kato is not only the director of Another Eden, he's also the scenario writer, script writer, and concept artist for the game. Also along for the ride is Yasunori Mitsuda, composer for all 3 official Chrono games. Okay, but is that enough to make it a spiritual successor? No. So, what makes it a spiritual successor? Well, we've got time travel. We've got an end-of-time area. We've got a talking frog knight from the past who joins your party. No, his name isn't Glenn, because Kato doesn't have the rights to Chrono Trigger characters. They need to protect themselves from lawsuits after all. Instead, he's named Cyrus, the name of Glenn's best friend from Chrono Trigger. Also, let me introduce you to Ashtir, who totally isn't Luca from Chrono Trigger. She's an inventor girl that lives in the first village with the same last name as Luca from Chrono Trigger, but in the same way that Abel in Xenosaga totally isn't Abel from Xenogears, Ashtir totally isn't Luca from Chrono Trigger because legal reasons. Wink wink. That's just the tip of the iceberg, but suffice to say, there's a lot of Chrono Trigger allusions inside Another Eden. However, it's not just Easter eggs and references that make this game a spiritual successor. The general pacing of the narrative really reminds you of the Chrono games, with a good balance of fun, comedy, action, excitement, melodrama, wistful reflection, tearjerker moments, plot twists, and more. It's a fun and compelling RPG that really captures the essence of the other Chrono games and feels like a good, modern middle ground between Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross. Like Chrono Cross, Another Eden boasts a massive cast, as most characters are obtained from gacha pools. However, the character writing is generally stronger than Chrono Cross, and each character has numerous side stories that help flesh out their characterization, and the party members you come across in the main story are generally more well-developed than the cast in Cross. So despite having a Cross-sized cast, the strength and focus of the characterization is closer to Trigger's than Cross's. I'll admit the characters in Another Eden aren't as strong as the cast in Dimensions 2, but again, that's because the latter chose to focus on a tight, small party, and Another Eden does the cast of thousands better than the vast majority of games that take such an approach. The game's story centers around a teenage boy named Aldo and his sister Fen. One day their peaceful village is invaded by the villainous Beast King, who seeks to use Fen's hidden powers to destroy all humans in the world, leaving his beast race to dominate the planet. In his attempt to rescue Fen, Aldo is flown in time and must make his way back to rescue his sister and all of space-time itself. While it might not sound a lot like Chrono Trigger on paper, aside from the time travel aspect, there's more mirrors to the story than you might think. And I know a lot of folks care about spoilers, so I won't go into them now. As I mentioned previously, Another Eden is free to play on phone and PC, and it was definitely designed as a mobile game first, given that it does not have built-in controller support. However, if you do some configuring with Joy to Key, it's fairly easy to play with a controller, and controls like a SNES RPG, though you will need to use the mouse periodically even if you're using a controller. Another Eden is not Chrono Trigger and has its own identity, and there's a lot to love. It has an interesting world, great characters, well-balanced gameplay, and tons of side content. I'm a big fan of the cat collecting side quest. I'm a cat lover, so I'm all here for that. But even with the new things Another Eden brings to the table, it also has a metric ton of intentional callbacks to Trigger, and is made by the same writer of all three officially released Chrono games. So for me, this absolutely counts as a Chrono game, in the same way that Xenosaga counts as a Xeno game. It's a high recommendation from me, and is a must-play for any die-hard Chrono fan. Side note, the main character in Another Eden, Aldo, shares the same name as a character from another Masato Kato written game, Final Fantasy XI. Both Aldo in Final Fantasy XI and Another Eden have big dramatic storylines relating to a close relationship with their sister and facing conflict when beastmen attack the pair of siblings. And while I wasn't fully satisfied with how that plotline resolved itself in Final Fantasy XI, it's nice to see Kato rework it here, because he absolutely nails it in Another Eden. By the way, did you know I just dropped a video explaining all of the Final Fantasy XI expansions? Be sure to check it out after this video. For now, let's move on to the next game in the ranking. Number 5. Complex Dream. If you feel like Another Eden doesn't count as a Chrono game, then Complex Dream certainly does. As mentioned previously, Another Eden has a lot of side content, like an MMO, and in the same way that Final Fantasy XIV's main story continues with expansion packs, so does Another Eden's. In addition to the main story updates, Another Eden has crossover events called Symphonies, but unlike a lot of crossover events in live service games, Another Eden Symphonies are mini 5 to 10 hour RPGs contained within Another Eden, complete with full narrative arcs, unique gameplay mechanics, opening cinematic movies, unique OSTs, final bosses, and side quests. Another Eden has multiple crossovers with series like Persona, Tales, Octopath Traveler, and others. And what's really exciting about these crossovers is that the game will actually incorporate special gameplay mechanics from whatever game Another Eden is doing a crossover with into the Symphony. Complex Dream is Another Eden's crossover with Chrono Cross, so finally, after 20 years, Masato Kato was able to return to the Chronoverse with a new, honest-to-goodness, official Chrono game, and it's great. Complex Dream adds the Chrono Cross element system into Another Eden, but not only that, the scenario has branching paths, special new locations, side quests, multiple endings, and most importantly, a new Game Plus feature. Given that your first playthrough of Complex Dream will be about 5 to 10 hours, if you decide to be a completionist with Complex Dream, it could easily equal Chrono Trigger in length. Complex Dream's story revolves around the heroes of Another Eden stumbling into an alternate timeline, another world, if you will. In this world, Aldo, the main character of Another Eden, died in his battle against the Beast King, and the Beastmen have come to dominate the land. Travelers from another dimension have arrived in this another world as well, and one of them, Lynx, has made close allies with the Beast King, but his machinations are far greater than a mere military alliance. It's up to Aldo, Surge, and the others to save both Aldo's homeworld and this another world from Lynx's diabolical plans. Complex Dream's narrative is even tighter and better constructed than the main game story. It fits into the overall narrative of Another Eden like a glove, feeling like an essential chapter in the overall Another Eden story, while at the same time telling a tight individual scenario that feels like a complete game. It also adds some excellent character moments for the Chrono Cross cast members that appear in the game. Surge, Kid, Harl, and Starkey are all playable characters within Complex Dream. What's more, if you beat Complex Dream, any of the Chrono Cross characters that you unlocked become permanent party members for the rest of your playthrough of Another Eden, and they are some of the strongest units in the game. While Another Eden is a gacha, and you could rely on random gacha pulls to obtain strong units, if you decide to just play through side scenarios like Complex Dream, you can obtain some of the strongest units in the game without having to spend a cent. And again, if you're worried about this being a limited time event, like so many other gacha crossovers, you don't have to worry. Another Eden never removes content, so Complex Dream is available to play anytime. You do need to progress into the main story of Another Eden up to a certain point to unlock Complex Dream, but it should be easily doable within 5 to 10 hours of playing the base game, which again, is a great RPG in its own right. Complex Dream, like base Another Eden, is a must-play for Chrono fans. It was made by Masato Kato himself, with some new music by Mitsuda specifically for this collab. It's an honest-to-goodness official new Chrono game. Granted, it's not quite the sequel we were wanting. It's a crossover event within a free gacha game, and I admit it would be preferable to have a standalone title that isn't reliant on a live service model. The storytelling, while good, isn't quite on the quality of games yet to come on this list. However, the nostalgia triggers are played appropriately here. The character moments are excellent. The gameplay mechanics are strong, the replay value is high, the atmosphere is pitch perfect, and it's truly an excellent experience for fans of the Chrono series who want something new from the series, and again, this one comes from the mind of Kato himself. If you don't mind spending a few minutes setting up Joy to Key and can get past the biases of gacha titles, you absolutely need to play this title. And even if you're one of those gacha haters, I do really think you should still try it. As of the making of this video, this is the final official Chrono release. It's a fantastic traditional JRPG and a worthy addition to the franchise. Number 4. Crimson Echoes / Flames of Eternity. Crimson Echoes is quite possibly the most legendary fan video game of all time. It's a sequel to Chrono Trigger that leads into the events of Chrono Cross as an attempt to better bridge the two stories together. And like Prophet's Guile, this game is once again made using the original Chrono Trigger ROM as its engine, meaning the same gameplay mechanics of the original Chrono Trigger are intact. However, unlike Prophet's Guile, which didn't really create any original assets, Crimson Echoes is full of original characters, brand new sprites, new locations, new time periods, and it's also a full-length 25 to 30 hour JRPG, just like the original Chrono Trigger. The plot of the game revolves around the heroes from the original Chrono Trigger uncovering a new threat to the timeline, and through the guidance of Balthazar in the future city of Chronopolis, they traverse through new time periods to stop the villainous King Zeal, who has been manipulating the timeline in order to gain the power of Lavos and become a god. Crimson Echoes is an incredibly impressive game in many respects. The fact that it's a well-balanced, well-paced, 30-hour JRPG with minimal bugs is certainly impressive, as is the fact that the devs used the original Chrono Trigger game as its base, rather than RPG Maker. But by far the most impressive part about Crimson Echoes is the writing. The writing in Crimson Echoes doesn't feel like fan fiction or like a fan game, but rather, it feels like an honest-to-goodness professional product. There may be one or two writing choices that make Crimson Echoes feel like a fan game, specifically in regards to the characterization of Chrono and Frog, but 99% of the game feels like something Kato and Takeda would have written together. The game even features different chapters, where the player takes control of different party members for specified scenarios, a feature that Takeda loves using in his games, and it works really well in Crimson Echoes, and feels like an evolution of the creativity the devs had with their first project, Prophet's Guile, and the gameplay possibilities of different party combinations. If you ever wondered what a solo Marl chapter would play like, Crimson Echoes has one, and the benefits to both gameplay and narrative are felt with all of the design choices. It's honestly incredible how good the narrative in this game is. The idea of turning Chronopolis into the new hub, end-of-time base of operations was a brilliant one, adding great characterization to Balthazar to help build up Chrono Cross. It's also great to visit 1 AD and to discover what the citizens of Chrono's world would consider to be a massive dividing line in their history. It's a very clever idea, and the pacing between major story beats is possibly even more impressive than the original game, given how everything ties together, and that is incredibly high praise. However, the most impressive piece of writing in Crimson Echoes is, by far, the character of King Guile. King Guile was only an implied presence in the original Chrono Trigger, but in Crimson Echoes he is a full-blown character that ends up consistently stealing whatever scene he's in. He's a force to be reckoned with. If Queen Guile was mad with lunacy, like Kefka, King Guile is closer to Dragon Ball Z's perfect self. He's powerful, confident, and is steadily playing 4D chess against our heroes. He's mighty in mind and in magic, and he's one of the best characters in the entire series, fan or not. King Guile originated in Crimson Echoes, and has become so popular that other fan games like Chrono Source and Chrono Alter have included him as a character. At this point, in the Chrono fan community, King Guile is basically canon, and we have Crimson Echoes to thank for this incredible character. In fact, Crimson Echoes, in terms of writing, feels like a canon piece of the Chronoverse. Crimson Echoes is an incredible accomplishment of fan-made video games because it doesn't feel like a fan-made game, and I've met fans who believe that Crimson Echoes is even better than the original Chrono Trigger. While I don't quite believe that to be so, the fact that there is legitimate debate around that subject goes to show how high quality this fantastic game is. Sadly, the thing that Crimson Echoes is most famous for is receiving a cease and desist letter from Square Enix as the game was approaching completion. The game was in the debugging stage and was around 95% complete when they received the letter from Square demanding the project be shut down, lest they face legal action, and part of the demand was that the ROM not get leaked online. So anyway, the ROM eventually got leaked online. Before the ROM got leaked, the only way to experience Crimson Echoes was through a YouTube walkthrough one of the devs uploaded as a swan song to the project after the cease and desist. But thankfully some brave soul uploaded the ROM, and the world was finally able to experience Crimson Echoes, myself included. I adored my time with the game and thought it fully lived up to the hype. A few years later, a different group of Chrono Trigger fans got together and decided to create a fan patch of Crimson Echoes called Flames of Eternity. This was not the same team who made the original Crimson Echoes, so yes, we've got a fan mod of a fan game, fanception of the highest order, a fan game within a fan game. Flames of Eternity is mostly the same game, but with some bug fixes, a few differences in terms of graphics and music. Most noticeably, you play as Human Glenn in the game as opposed to his frog form in Crimson Echoes. One character death was removed, but for the most part, it's basically the same game, and it really comes down to personal preference which version you decide to play, Crimson Echoes or Flames of Eternity. Nowadays, Flames of Eternity is by far the more popular version of the game, but I think I actually prefer the Crimson Echoes version. With the similarly titled indie RPG Chained Echoes out now, the original version of Crimson Echoes is falling further into obscurity, where some fans don't even know the game has any other title other than Flames of Eternity. But I'm old, so to me, it'll always be Crimson Echoes. Crimson Echoes and Flames of Eternity showcase fan creativity at its finest. Chrono fans are some of the most passionate in the gaming community. The care and effort that went into making Crimson Echoes is shown in the quality of the product, which transcends beyond simply a great fan game, but is instead simply a great game, period, with one of the best stories in all of RPG history. Square should do what Sega does, and reach out to these devs to release this game officially, because it deserves its place in the sun, alongside the official entries in the series. It's a masterpiece, and absolutely worth playing if you're a die-hard Chrono fan, or just want to play a great JRPG. A fan game that feels both canon and professional, full of heart, creativity, and passion. A must-play. Number 3. Chrono Cross. Chrono Cross is a very divisive and controversial game in the JRPG community. It's the sequel to one of the most beloved video games of all time, and Chrono Cross inverted fan expectations at almost every level. Cross gets a lot of hate from fans of the original Chrono Trigger who don't like how drastically different it is from the first game in the series. And a lot of fans argue as to whether or not Cross even counts as a sequel to Trigger, given the massive differences in gameplay, art direction, and narrative. I honestly have very little respect for the latter argument, and while I have sympathy for those who simply wanted a Chrono Trigger 2 continuing the gameplay of the first game alongside the cast of the original, I'm extremely grateful that Chrono Cross is the game we got, because it's one of the greatest JRPGs of all time. Chrono Cross is a brilliant deconstruction and inversion of Chrono Trigger, diving deeper into the themes and core concepts of the original, but twisting them in such a way that forces introspection and a new perspective, much in the same way that Hunter x Hunter deconstructed the tropes of shonen anime, and the deconstruction is done brilliantly. To me, that's a lot more interesting than just following the same cast going on more adventures, which, don't get me wrong, can be great, but what Cross does here is absolutely masterful. Instead of showing a direct narrative continuation to the cast of the first game, their presence lingers in the background like shadows, the effects of their actions rippling through Cross's narrative. But we do also get direct continuation of political conflicts from the first game, and direct continuation of the stories of particular characters. It's most definitely a sequel, but not a sequel that one would expect. However, the introspection this game offers as it dives deeper into its existentialist themes is among the best in any RPG, and it's done brilliantly. The basic plot of Chrono Cross revolves around a boy named Surge, who lives in the El Nido archipelago, a location not found in the first Chrono game. Surge gets transported into another world, a timeline parallel to his. 10 years prior, the timeline split in two due to a certain event. In the timeline of Another World, Surge drowned on a beach 10 years prior, while in Surge's home world, he continued living a happy and peaceful life. As Surge tries to unravel the mystery of these parallel worlds, he finds himself allying with a young thief named Kid, and opposed to a mysterious feline humanoid known as Lynx. While the basic premise of the game might sound like it has nothing to do with Chrono Trigger, Cross is very much a continuation of that game. The political conflict between Poor and Guardia lingers in the background of Cross, and informs the world building brilliantly. The El Nido archipelago might be a new location, but its in-lore explanation is absolutely spectacular. The effects of time travel and the implications it has on the world are explored in interesting and unique ways. Rather than traveling between different eras in time, the player travels between different timelines, still allowing for a similar approach to exploration of the first game, but with a unique twist. I know there are folks in the comments who will argue that even the developers themselves said that Chrono Cross is not a sequel, but if you look at the full context of the quotes, they aren't saying that in regards to narrative canon, but into the approach of fully deconstructing and reimagining how the narrative and gameplay could be approached, without the limitations of following the exact same formula of the first game. Scala, Balthazar, Robo, Luca, Mother Brain, and Lavos are all incredibly important characters in Chrono Cross's narrative, continuing their stories from the previous game in unexpected but compelling ways, and I wish more sequels were this interesting with their narrative approach. It's not different merely for the sake of being different, but a deliberate artistic statement that adds an entire new layer to the original game. Cross is bittersweet in its resolution and reflection upon Chrono Trigger, leaving most of the main cast of the first game with incredibly bleak fates. And while I'm not a fan of darkness for the sake of darkness, everything Chrono Cross does in relation to Trigger is something that feels both like a logical canon outcome of the previous adventure and thematically appropriate from both a character level and overall contextual level for the ideas the series wants to explore. The original Chrono Trigger offered a sense of unease and isolation when Chrono first traveled to the Middle Ages and had to face the discomfort of an unknown world similar to his, yet different. And that same idea is explored as Surge travels to a world where he is nothing but a ghost, a lingering presence looming in the background akin to the cast in the meta-narrative sense. Both games capture this sense of isolation brilliantly, taking the same ideas, but Cross reworks them in interesting ways to feel fresh and further explore those ideas. It's hard to top the overwhelming feeling of isolation that Surge has the first time the player ventures into another world alone. That is, of course, assuming you didn't recruit the pink talking dog from your home village first. A big critique of Chrono Cross is its massive cast, which many argue is of inferior quality to the original Chrono Trigger. Instead of a tight cast of 7 playable characters, Chrono Cross has a gigantic cast of 45 recruitable party members, and detractors of the cast argue that the characters are underdeveloped and vary in quality due to their eccentricities. You have more serious characters like the pirate Captain Fargo, but you also got Nikki fighting with the power of rock and roll, a luchador exorcist, and even a freaking alien. The nice thing about Chrono Cross, and its large cast, is that you can take the story as seriously as you want to. If you want serious human characters with dramatic pasts to be your party, you can do that. But if you're like me, and will always bring along a pink talking animal if that's an option, well, you can do that too. While it would have been nice to have more characterization and deeper backstories for the Chrono Cross cast, I can safely say that it's an excellent RPG cast, and one of the more underrated ones out there. While there might be some weaknesses in terms of individual character arcs for each member of the cast, the overall narrative of Cross is extremely strong. The game brilliantly tackles concepts like man versus nature, fate and destiny, and plenty of other existentialist themes throughout Chrono Cross's epic adventure. Chrono Cross is a vibe, and has some of the best moodiness in any RPG, period, and quite possibly the best. I guess I should talk about gameplay. Chrono Cross, like Chrono Trigger, has no random battles, and instead you engage enemies by running into them on the map. Battles are no longer ATB, but are turn-based, with a sophisticated yet intuitive elemental system. To avoid excessive grinding with its large cast, Cross essentially eliminates EXP from random battles, and instead boosts all party member stats after boss fights. In addition to this, every battle in the game, including bosses, can be bled from, and stats recover after battles. So if you need to rework your strategy, you can do so easily, with little to no penalty. It's a game that rewards understanding the mechanics and not just grinding, and while not quite as brilliant as Chrono Trigger, it's still an incredibly fun gameplay experience. Beyond that, Chrono Cross has incredibly stunning visuals, arguably the best on the PlayStation 1. The locales in Chrono Cross are still breathtaking all these years later. And the soundtrack, again composed by Yasunori Mitsuda, is possibly his best work. Even detractors of Cross admit that it has a top-tier JRPG soundtrack, and stands as one of the greatest video game OSTs ever made. While some may criticize the underutilization and tragic fates of the characters from the original Chrono Trigger, in my opinion, this only adds to the bittersweet tone and themes of Cross's narrative, and enhances the experience of both games greatly. Chrono Cross is a genius sequel that took a bold new direction for the series, and is a stone-cold classic of the PlayStation 1 Squaresoft Golden Era. It's a fine successor to Chrono Trigger, and an underrated classic. Number 2, Xenogears. It almost feels like cheating having Xenogears on this list. Xenogears is an incredible, all-time classic RPG that has its own rich legacy, and even has its own spiritual successors in the Xenosaga and Xenoblade games, much like how Chrono Trigger does with Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 and Another Eden. Xenogears has an identity that is wholly unique, and has quite possibly the greatest narrative in all of video gaming. In fact, upon reflection, it might actually be the best game in this ranking, and as time goes on, my opinion of the game continues to rise and rise. However, it does contain more flaws than the number 1 game on this list, and in a neck-and-neck race between two masterpieces, every little thing counts. What ultimately pushed me over the edge to ranking Xenogears second on this list is that it's a ranking of the Chrono games, and I didn't have the heart to put it above Chrono Trigger on a list of ranking the Chrono games. It felt wrong, but it might actually be the winner for best game on this list. I don't know. Sound off in the comments. Xenogears is a PlayStation 1 RPG, and is the directorial debut of legendary game developer Tetsuya Takahashi. The game was written by Takahashi, his wife Soraya Saga, and Chrono series veteran Masato Kato, and tells the story of Fei Fong Wang, an amnesiac martial artist who, alongside a ragtag group of allies, pilot giant robots to free humanity from a treacherous demiurge. It's also an epic love story and has some of the deepest psychological themes of any video game. To try to briefly describe the plot of Xenogears is a fool's errand, as it is arguably the most dense narrative in all of video gaming. Xenogears began its life as a plot proposal for Square's then upcoming Final Fantasy VII, before being reworked into a Chrono Trigger sequel and then, eventually, into its own IP. It's interesting to see which elements from Xenogears eventually ended up in Final Fantasy VII, and which elements of Chrono Trigger ended up appearing inside Xenogears. In the former case, we can see similarities between Cloud's arc and that of the lead of Xenogears, and there are similarities in the cosmic threats of both games. But let's take a closer look at the elements of Chrono Trigger that ended up in Xenogears and what it might have meant for a Chrono sequel. In terms of character graphics, Xenogears looks the most like Chrono Trigger of all the spiritual successors, as the proportions of the sprites and general style seem like a logical evolution of the Chrono series, moving between console generations, ultimately looking more like a Chrono Trigger 2 than Chrono Cross does. And like Chrono Trigger, Radical Dreamers, and Chrono Cross, the score for Xenogears was done by Yasunori Mitsuda, and you could easily hear a lot of the musical similarities between this game and the other Chrono games because of his compositional style. Heck, Luca from Chrono Trigger even makes a cameo in Xenogears, though it's more of a fun Easter egg than real canon. But that's all surface level obvious stuff. Let's take a look at the narrative and general structure to see where the edges were filed off, and see what elements were specifically from when the game was intended to be a Chrono sequel, and what those elements might have originally been. For starters, the game has a very complicated story, and a lot of it revolves around different eras in the past that the player doesn't directly experience or play through. While a lot of these eras were relegated to cutscenes and serve mostly as lore, The narrative importance of the events in these different eras of time shows what might have at one point been different points in time that the characters would have traveled to if the concept of remaining a Chrono sequel remained intact. The general concept of Deus, an alien entity burrowing deep in the earth, controlling and manipulating the evolution of humanity for generations, is basically Lavos, but just goes a step further laying on thick the "this is the demiurge" metaphors. I'm also pretty sure that Krillin was Magus at one point in the development cycle, due to him coming from an advanced civilization in the past, having long blue hair, becoming a villain after the loss of a female close to him, and engaging in unsavory machinations for more power. There are things like that littered all throughout Xenogears that echo what this lost parallel universe Chrono Trigger 2 would have been, and it's fascinating to see. While there are some thematic similarities between Xenogears and Chrono Trigger, Xenogears ultimately goes deeper in those shared themes and offers plenty of new ones that Trigger never touched, like trauma and human psychology, that really separates it from its spiritual predecessor. While Kato was involved in the creation of Xenogears, his role seemed to be mostly serving as a balancing force to keep Takahashi from making the game too dark and bleak, adding a sense of fun and campiness that is, in my opinion, essential to the game's charm. While there are some folks who really wish Xenogears was brooding and serious the whole time, I like the fact that Choo-Choo and Blanca from Street Fighter are playable party members. It's stuff like that, mixed in with deep, serious themes, brilliant world building, and incredible character work that make Xenogears great, at least for me. Kato's levity is a big part of the charm of Xenogears, but with that acknowledged, it's clear that this is Takahashi's and Saga's show, and it's an incredible artistic statement. The game does have some flaws in terms of polish, which isn't surprising given how grand the scope of the narrative was and how inexperienced the staff was. Honestly, the game is a masterpiece, and the flaws are either insignificant or add to the game's charm, but I admit that they are there. While I think Disc 2 is rad, I know there are pacing issues, and there's nothing in Chrono Trigger as frustrating as Babel Tower. Also, I know that the storylines of Rico and Maria fall off as quickly as they start. So, yeah, there are a couple parts that could have used more polish, but the thing is, overall, the game is incredibly polished and is an all-time classic. It tackles love, psychology, and religion better than almost every other video game in existence. I know people who claim Xenogears as not only their favorite game of all time, but also argue it's the greatest game ever made, and honestly, as a story-first gamer, it's hard to argue with them. Xenogears is a masterpiece of narrative video gaming. It's a game I love more and more as time goes by, and at this point in my life, I might like it by the tiniest of margins, less than the length of a strand of hair, more than Chrono Trigger, due to the depth of Xenogears' narrative. But it's as close to a tie as I could get in this ranking, and because it's so close, I can't in good conscience rank it as the best Chrono game if I'm ranking games in the Chrono series. That doesn't take away my love for the game or its masterpiece status. Xenogears is one of the greatest video games, nay, pieces of art, ever made by humanity. And if you haven't played it yet, you need to, immediately. A stone-cold classic. Number 1. Chrono Trigger. Come on, of course Chrono Trigger has to rank as number 1. What can I say about Chrono Trigger that hasn't already been said? It's essentially a perfect video game. Chrono Trigger is a brilliant, perfectly paced, grind-free RPG. The visuals are the peak of the Super Nintendo. The soundtrack is legendary. The elimination of random battles and having all of the battles take place on the map screen is absolutely brilliant, as are the dual and triple tech systems. The new Game Plus feature, invented here, is one of the greatest gaming innovations ever, and the numerous endings offer an incredible amount of replay value. Chrono Trigger's side quests are some of the best in video gaming, offering great additional story, exciting new locations, and fantastic item rewards, all without overstaying their welcome. The narrative is tightly written, clever, and perfectly balances comedy, action, fun, twists and turns, powerful drama, somber reflection, deep themes, and strong emotional moments, with its brilliant balance of Hironobu Sakaguchi's flair for the dramatic and Akira Toriyama's comedic and shonen sensibilities. While the story isn't as deep as Xenogears, Chrono Trigger's story is incredibly underrated and doesn't get enough praise for how masterful it is. It's simple on paper. A group of time travelers attempt to prevent the apocalypse, but it's told in such a brilliant way, with incredible set pieces, and one of the best JRPG casts in history. The party members in Chrono Trigger have striking, iconic, bold designs and big personalities, as to be expected with Toriyama creations, but the Sakaguchi influence adds layers of depth and drama that truly make them compelling. Luca's arc with her mother, Frog's quest for redemption, and Magus's determination to save Scala no matter the cost are all incredible pieces of character writing, and are absolutely brilliant. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that basically everything involving Frog or Magus is some of the best storytelling in video game history, and they are two of my favorite fictional characters ever. The twist involving Chrono is genuinely shocking, clever, and one of the best twists in gaming history. The game's subtle religious metaphors are woven throughout in a way that adds an extra layer of depth for those willing to go beneath the surface of a fun Toriyama time travel adventure, and thus the perfect balance between fun and deep is found within Trigger. It's the first game where Yasunori Mitsuda was the lead composer, and while some folks prefer Chrono Cross, I prefer Trigger's soundtrack, and think it's Mitsuda's best work. There were two other composers who helped fill out the tracks for Chrono Trigger. Noriko Matsueda contributed one track, and there were 9 tracks composed by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu, and they're some of the best tracks he's ever done as well. The staff credits of this game are absolutely insane, and it is truly a dream team of RPG developers. I'll list off a few. Kazuhiko Aoki, Yoshinori Kitase, Akihiko Matsui, Takashi Tokita, Akira Toriyama, Yuji Horii, Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yasunori Mitsuda, Nobuo Uematsu, Tetsuya Takahashi, Hiroyuki Ito, Masato Kato, and Tetsuya freaking Nomura. It's absurd how much talent gathered together to make this game. Chrono Trigger is that perfect melding of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy themes, offering something that's more fun and vibrant than Final Fantasy, but also more deep and reflective than Dragon Quest. It's the best of both worlds, but it doesn't merely feel like a mashup. Chrono Trigger is its own thing, and has a unique identity that is greater than the sum of its parts, and given how many great parts are contained within it, makes the game that much more impressive. It's one of the finest video games ever made, an absolute classic, the best RPG on the Super Nintendo console, and is often argued to be the greatest RPG, if not the greatest video game, ever made. Its legacy endures to this day, and even though Square Enix has mostly let the franchise lie dormant, the passion from fans has never died down. Fans still long for a new sequel to Trigger, despite the original coming out some 30-odd years ago. And if Square doesn't make a new Chrono game, I have no doubt that fans will continue to make new games in the series, even at the risk of cease and desist, because their love for Chrono Trigger is so high. And who can blame them? Chrono Trigger is a mixture of passion and emotion alongside brilliant craftsmanship. The lovable heroes defying fate, defying the odds to save the world, is a primal desire within all of us, to protect the home that we love, even if it seems to be impossible. There is so much heart contained within Chrono Trigger that it wasn't able to be contained within a single game. And that heart, that spirit, I think will continue until the end of time. As a little bonus to this video, I figured I would tell you what I would do if I was in charge of helming a new game in the Chrono franchise. And I made a couple of quickie sprite images so you wouldn't have to look at a blank screen while I explain the concept. They're a bit rough and ready, so please excuse the quality. If I were to make a new Chrono game, the characters wouldn't look as generic as the images I'm presenting, but they're just meant to offer a little bit of visual representation. Now, oftentimes when you hear a YouTuber talking about their fantasy game sequel, they don't take into realistic considerations of game development like budgetary concerns, and the plot ideas often fall into one of two categories. Unoriginal fan service, relying too much on the original source material with nothing new added, or something so drastically different that it feels like absurd fan fiction. Crimson Echoes, to their credit, felt like an honest-to-goodness sequel, and it's proof that a fan concept can be made into a game that feels in line with the original, while also offering unique ideas of their own. So, I'll let you be the judge as to whether or not you like my idea for a Chrono sequel. My idea for a Chrono sequel, let's call it Chrono Break, would play similar to the original Chrono Trigger as an intentionally retro callback. It would offer an ATB battle system, dual techs, and traversing different world maps like the original game. However, instead of going to different time periods, the player would be going to different timelines, similar to Chrono Cross, but instead of traversing between two worlds, you would traverse between several, similar to the way you traverse through different eras in the original Chrono Trigger. So in that way, it would be a return to form of both Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross simultaneously. My idea for Chrono Break would take place about 30 years after the fall of Guardia to Por. The game would focus on 3 characters, Tice, Genion, and Lyra, from the village of Truce, childhood friends entering into their teenage years. Tice is your typical, aloof, shonen anime spiky-haired, carefree protag. Lyra is a book-smart and soft-spoken teenage girl. And Genion is a bulky demi-human dealing with the unfair prejudices of his people. While the three of them have been best of friends for almost the entirety of their lives, a wrench is thrown into the friendship when Tice and Lyra begin dating, and Genian deals with feelings of unrequited love towards Lyra. In an attempt to mend their friendship, Lyra gives each of them matching necklaces with a gemstone in the center, which she received through her family's antiquities business. The necklaces are meant to serve as a symbol of the three of them always being together, even if they're apart. It's Lyra's last-ditch effort to try to reconcile the three friends as their pathways begin to diverge. Of course, little do they know that these necklaces are the pendant from the original Chrono Trigger, ransacked from Guardia Castle and modified into its current form. The necklaces end up warping all three of the friends to different timelines, and each of the three characters would go on their own adventure. Much like Star Ocean: The Second Story, the player would choose their protagonists at the start of the game, Tice, Genian, or Lyra, and follow their scenario as they hop between different timelines. Instead of focusing on a large cast like Chrono Cross, it would be a return to a tight, focused cast like Trigger, with emphasis on focusing on the characterization of the three main leads. Each lead character would encounter different party members that complement their playstyles, and the narratives of these three scenarios would weave together in such a way that offers great replay value, encouraging the player to go through each path to see how everything connects. There would be variants in the order, timelines, and locations are visited between the three playthroughs, so while there would be a reuse of assets, the different scenarios experienced would keep things from feeling repetitive, much in the same way that the original Chrono Trigger kept locations fresh and interesting despite returning to traverse similar terrain, and eventually all of the storylines would connect in a fashion that would do Takashi Tokita proud. The overall focus of the narrative would be a coming-of-age story, as each of the three friends find their identity, but other existentialist themes would of course be tackled. My idea for the timelines include the following: a timeline where Guardia loses the war with Poor, a timeline where Guardia does not lose the war with Poor, a timeline where the Reptites dominate the planet, a timeline where Reptites and fish-like humanoids dominate the planet, a timeline where Guardia lost the war to Magus in 600 AD, and a timeline where the impact of Lavos killed off most living creatures on the planet, drastically altering the biosphere. Much in the same way that the original Chrono Trigger had 6 primary eras the player would jump between, this would offer the player 6 timelines to jump between, but all existing in the present of that timeline, like Chrono Cross. So again, it blends the concept of the first game and the second RPG together, while still offering something different. The ability to reuse assets would speed up the development process and lower costs, and given the graphical style, it would be fairly easy to make world maps on the same scale as the original Trigger. With the addition of the extra scenarios, this would lead to Chrono Break being marginally bigger in terms of scope, but definitely within reasonable development expectations. I have a lot of ideas about specific sub-scenarios within the different timelines, and I won't go into all of them here, but I'll give you a quick taste of some of the concepts I have in mind. Like Genian encountering a timeline where demi-humans face less discrimination and teaming up with a Guardian Knight. There's one scenario where Lyra, while in a timeline where Magus won the Mystic War, encounters an ambitious mage who dreams of winning a magic-based combat tournament. And there's another scenario of Tice having a wacky adventure with all kinds of dangerous monsters in the timeline where Lavos changed the biosphere. I also have ideas regarding a secret society who travels between timelines, and a big part of the narrative would be focusing on the origins of the Lavos species, and how even though Lavos might have been defeated, Lavos is ultimately just one of many similar planetary parasites. Oh, and there's also a space station known as Zervon that exists outside of time that helps explain some unanswered questions from the original Chrono Trigger. Like I said, I have lots of ideas of stuff to explore in this sequel if I were to make one. Anyway, that's a very brief overview of what I would do for a Chrono sequel, if I was given the reins to head a project like that. Square Enix, hire me. And if I wasn't given the reins to head a project like that, but I was given a budget and a team for an indie RPG, I would change the proper nouns and make it not a Chrono sequel, wink wink, like another Eden, but still have the concept of multiple timelines and the origins of the planetary parasite alien species. Theoretically, I could do all of this in RPG Maker, but with games like Sea of Stars and Chained Echoes on the market, it wouldn't be worth the effort unless I could have gameplay on par with those games, and I don't have the programming chops for that. I'm a writer, that's my skill set, so unless there's a team of folks interested in working with me, my Chrono sequel idea will sit collecting dust. But hey, if you're an indie dev and think this idea sounds cool, talk to me. I did try to turn this idea into a web novel by changing the proper nouns and making it into an original concept called Radiant Epic, which I did with a co-writer friend of mine, and we decided to just do the prologue section in novel form to see if we had fun with it, kinda like the prequel novel for Final Fantasy XIII. We approached Radiant Epic similar to Xenogears, where it began as a Chrono sequel, and we changed it enough to be our own IP. The project was enjoyable, but our writing styles didn't work quite as well together as we initially thought they would, And the fact that we forced ourselves to release weekly chapters meant there wasn't much time for communication or editing, so there were more typos and repetitive prose than either of us would like. With all of my jokes about the typos and other fan games, I must admit to being guilty of them as well. But in fairness, writing new chapters of a novel every week when working 2 jobs is really hard. So if I put the letter A twice in a row, it's not the worst thing in the world. And we never had anti-union propaganda in our web novel, so we have that going for it. Reading to Epoch was a nice experiment, and if you're interested you can read it for some additional insights into the characterization of the 3 main leads I mentioned. We changed quite a bit to make it less obviously Chrono Trigger, but you can still see the skeleton of Trigger within the novel. And if I were to redo the project, I would probably want to return it back to its Chrono roots. And again, apologies for the typos and some repetitive prose in the early chapters. We thought making it a weekly web novel was a cool writing challenge, and the deadlines allowed for more mistakes in the process than if we had proper editors. It took a few chapters for us to get into the swing of things, shaking off the rust as it were, so don't judge it too harshly by the prose of the early chapters. You could definitely afford to go back and be properly edited, but I enjoyed the project for what it was. But yeah, that's my little bonus section for the end of the video. Thanks for watching my ranking of the Chrono games, and I hope you were able to find out about some cool games you didn't know existed. I know there are plenty of Chrono fans like myself who are hungry for more from the series. And luckily for us, the Chrono fan community has created some amazing games to satiate us. It might seem like the franchise is limited, with only Trigger, Cross, and Radical Dreamers, but when you add together all of the games on this list, you've got a pretty decent-sized RPG franchise, with plenty of Chrono content to dive into. And given how much I love Chrono Trigger, it makes me really happy that all of these games exist. Again, thanks for watching, and if you want more RPG content from me, check out my new video discussing all of the Final Fantasy XI expansions, or check out my Final Fantasy ranking playlist. Did you find anything new on this list you plan on checking out? Have you also beaten all of these games? Let me know in the comments section below, and yeah, let's have a cool discussion about the Chrono games. Cheers!